Hi guys, this is Korak from Edureka. Welcome to today's session on Linux file systems explained. Now, before we start the topic at hand, let's just discuss today's agenda. First up, we take a look at the brief history of Linux, how it came into existence, what it's developed from, all of that. Then we talk about what a Linux file system is, followed by the types of Linux file systems that are there. Then we have the Linux file system architecture, file system directories that are present, the different features of Linux file systems, and finally we end with a demo of the Linux file system. Also, if you do like our videos, please do subscribe to the Edureka channel. And if you're looking for a DevOps certification training, please do check out the link in the comments below. So let's get started. First up, let's talk about Linux and how it came into existence, right? So when we talk about Linux, first thing we need to know is that Linux was basically developed in the early 90s, which is basically 1991 to be exact, by Finnish engineer Linus Torvalds, right? So this was basically built based on the Unix system called Minix, right? So Linux is basically based out of Unix, just like Windows is based out of DOS, right? So Linux is basically an open source and community developed operating system. Unlike Windows, you don't have open source code in Windows, which you do in Linux, right? So this is the basic difference. So lastly, we see that Linux is basically supported on every major computer platform, be it AMD, be it Intel, like x86, all of that. So you can have Linux on any system you want, right? So this is all about the history of Linux is all about. But let's get moving on to what a Linux file system is. Now, when we talk about Linux file system, the first thing we need to know is what it is, right? So Linux file system is a set of processes that controls how, where, when data that is stored and retrieved from a storage device, how do you store it, where do you store it, when do you store it. All of those are basically taken care of by the file system, right? So a good file system is extremely essential for everyday system processes, right? A Linux file system is basically a structured collection of different files on a disk drive, right, or a partition. So what you can see is that the file system helps in basically making all the files present in the Linux system into much more structured, collected set of files. And as you know, in Linux, everything is a file, be it your devices, be it your applications, everything in Linux is a file, right? So file systems on Linux basically control how and where the data is stored, along with the fact that every partition consists of file system of their own. Just like in Windows, you have C drive, D drive, and all of that based on namespaces, right? In Python, there is no CD drive, although you can have partitions, but these partitions will basically have their own set of file systems, right? And the main thing is that file systems helps us store data systematically. So this is what a Linux file system is. Next up, we talk about the different types of Linux file systems. Now, when we talk about the different types of Linux file systems, there are approximately six types. The first is the ext. So ext is basically ext234, which basically stands for extended file system. Now ext2 was the first Linux file system that allows managing 2 TB of data. But at the current moment, ext4 is the fastest file system that you can have on Linux. Next up, we have the JFS. JFS basically stands for the Journal File System. Journal File System is basically developed by IBM along with Unix, right? So JFS is an alternative to the ext file system. ext is pretty useful, but JFS comes handy when you have a CPU whose power is very limited. The third kind of file system that you have is the RazorFS file system. So earlier, RazorFS was used as a default file system for Linux SUSE, but now they shifted to ext3. But what RazorFS does is that it dynamically supports the file extension but has certain performance drawbacks, which is why now people have again moved back to ext3 from RazorFS. So next up, we have the XFS. So when it comes to XFS, you can see that XFS was considered a high-speed JFS, which is the journal file system in high speed, which is developed for parallel I/O processing. Now, one example where XFS is used is basically by NASA. The next one is the BTRFS. Now, BTRFS basically stands for B-tree file system. It is basically a file system which is used for fault tolerance, repairs of the system, etc. Next up, we have the swap file system, which is the last kind of file system. So when it comes to swap file systems are used for memory paging in Linux OSs, right? So memory paging only comes into play when there is a system hibernation going on. So a system that never goes into hibernate is required to have swap space equal to RAM space, right? So swap space is always equal to RAM space for systems that never go into hibernation. Up next, we have the file system architecture. Now, when we talk about architecture, there are a lot of things we need to know. Let's get going. The first thing you need to know about the file system architecture is that it is a hierarchical file structure, and it can manage and provide for non-volatile storage data, along with the fact that the namespace describes logical structure of the file. Now, I'll tell you all about what all of these means. And finally, we see that advanced information about the partitions is always stored. So let's say, for example, this is your architecture where you have the kernel, you have the virtual file system, and you also have the different file systems that you want, right, along with the hardware in the end. So let's go through what I just explained you. So when I talk about hierarchical structure, what I mean is that this system basically has a root directory, and that root directory has certain subdirectories, right? So all other subdirectories can be accessed from the root directory. So this is what hierarchical structure means, right? So when I talk about the fact that it can provide for non-volatile storage data. When I talk about non-volatile storage data, I talk about RAM, I talk about ROM, right? So basically, this file system is designed in such a way that it can manage and provide space for non-volatile data, right? All systems require a namespace. So namespace is something that defines the naming process, the length of the file name, or a subset of characters that you have. So this namespace is also used for logically defining the structure of the file that you have, right? And finally, we see that the data structure needs to support a hierarchical directory structure, right? So the structure is used to describe the available and used disk space, right, for a particular block. So finally, we see that the advanced data that the structure stores or represents contains information about the file system stored on the drive, right? So this information that is contained about the partitions is completely distinct and independent from other file system metadata. Now let's look at this architecture we have. So the file system requires an API to access the function calls or to interact with file systems, right? So API facilitates tasks such as creating, deleting, and copying the files. When I talk about API, I mean application programming interface. So the first two parts of the given system file system together make up the Linux virtual file system, and it provides a single set of commands that you have. So next up, we talk about the different file system directories that are there. So let's get going. As you can see, the topmost file directory that you have is the root directory, and you can basically access any of these other directories that are there from the root directory itself. You can see there's bin, dev, etc, usr, home, lib, sbin, temp, where all of these files have certain functions, right? All of these directories have certain functions. They store some sort of information about the system, right? So let's take a look at some of the file directories that are there. So starting off, we talk about bin. Now, when we talk about bin, the bin directory contains mostly binaries. Now, when I talk about binaries is basically some of the applications and programs that you can run. So the ls command, which is basically the list of the files that you have. So the ls command that you have on Linux and other basic tools are also present in this directory, which is the bin directory, right? Then we talk about the dev directory. Now, when we talk about dev directory, we see that the dev directory contains device files, right? So many of these are generated at boot time or even on the fly, right? So you don't really have existing device files already present. So some of them are generated on the fly or when you boot the system, right? Next up, we have the etc. Now, this is fairly important because unlike the fact that etc stands for etc., here etc stands for everything to configure. So everything to configure because it contains most, if not all, the system-wide configuration calls, right? So all of the users, the passwords, the machines that are there on your network, the user, the password, all of these are present in the etc directory. Then we have the home directory. So when we talk about home directory, you can see that you find your user's personal directories here. For example, if let's say home/core contains my directories, home/guest will contain another guest's directory on the same system. Then we come to lib. Now, lib is basically short for libraries. All the libraries are found in this directory. Libraries are basically files containing code that your application may or may not need during runtime, right? So the library under root, it contains all the important kernel modules. As you can see, there are two different lib directories. One is under root and one is again under var, right? Now, before we get to that, we can see another directory, which is the media directory. Now, as you can understand, media directory is the directory where external storage will automatically be mounted when you try and plug it in or try to access it, right? So, media directory is the directory where if you connect storage device or an HDD, it'll automatically get mounted in your system, right? So these are the basic directories that are there. Let's move on to features of Linux file system. Now, when I talk about features, the basic three features that I can think about is the fact that Linux is case sensitive. Now, case sensitivity is because of the fact that it distinguishes between lowercase and uppercase characters, right? So there can be a file which is named test text with T capital, and there can be another file which has got the same name but none of the capital letters. So these are two different files in Linux, right? You don't need to rename them, you can have case sensitive files. Next up, we can see that Linux has various hidden files that are there. Now, Linux distinguishes between standard files and hidden files. Most configuration files are hidden in Linux OS, right? So usually we don't need to access or read these hidden files. The hidden files are represented by a dot before their file name, right? So I'll show you how you basically access the hidden files, or you can basically check out where the hidden files are. Next up, we see the different partitions, directories, and drives that are present in Linux, right? So Linux does not use drive letters to organize the drive as Windows does, right? Like local disk C, local disk D. Linux does not have that. In Linux, we cannot tell whether we are addressing a partition, a network, or an ordinary directory, because all of the files, all of the directories that are there, every application, every device, all of everything that you have is a file. Right. Even the file which has different commands is a different file. Even a command like ls is a different file which is present in bin. And we'll check that out in a while. Right. So next up, let's come to the demo for Linux file system. So basically, when you go into Linux, this is your interface that you have. So where can you find your files? You go to files. You can also check out your directories from the terminal, and that is basically what we're going to do. Now here you can see that there are no such partitions as such, right? You don't have a C drive, you don't have a D drive. So where do you find your system files like in C? So you can just go to other locations, go to computer, and as soon as you go to computer, you can see that these are the files that are there: the bin file, dev file, etc, home, lib, and you can basically go into these files. So basically some of these files have restricted access. So let's just go and see how you can access them through the terminal. So you basically go to your terminal, and let's just check out a few Linux commands now. So to basically see the files that you have in your system, just type in ls, right? And if you want to move into the directory, you have to put cd, right? Choose directory, and let's say desktop, right? And then let's say ls again. So this is basically how you cd into the desktop directory. Now, if you want to move into another directory, all you need to do is just cd space dot dot, and you move back here. And if you see ls now, you are back to square one where you can choose anything else, right? So if you want to clear this, you can just type clear, and you'll basically have your terminal good as new, right? So basically, you want to know what is the user that you are in called, right? So all you need to do is type in, right? So this is the name of the user that I have created, and it's called KB. And all you need to do to find out which user system you are currently on is just type in who am I, right? Moment you do that, your system user will be shown to you. So let's go back and check out something else. So now you basically see, if you type ls, this is all the directories that you have in your system. Like we talked about bin with your bin files, with your library files, the dev file, the etc home, all of these are there. Now what we can do is check out some of these directories that we have ready. So let's get going. So let's check out what is there in the bin file that we have, right? So let's choose the directory bin and choose it. We can do cd bin. Now we are inside bin. Let's check out the files that are there. So as you can see, these are the various files that are present in the bin, right? If you can check properly, you will also see that the ls command that we have is also a file that is present in the bin file, repeat, in the bin directory. So a command itself is also a file. Now this basically shows us that everything in Linux is basically a file, right? Now apart from ls, I can show you some other files which we talked about, which are directories as well. Like mount itself is another file which is present in bin and is a directory in itself as well. So as you can see, ls is a file. So let's go back to our term, right? So let's now check out, let's go clear this out, right? So let's check out this command called cat, right? So cat stands for concatenate. Now what concatenate does is basically takes any file and it shows you the binary and whatever is there. So this is basically the binary encoded file for your ls file which is present in the bin directory, right? So even for a command like this, you will basically have a binary encoded file which is there, right? So this is what cat does. It takes a file and shows you the contents of it. So the machine understandable language, that is this right now, is shown to you, right? So let's go back and clear this up, right? So let's now check out another command, which is a cp command. Let's say you want to repeat. Let's say you want to copy the contents of a file into another file that you make, right? So let's check out what you do for that. And you need the copy command, which is written by cp. So first you write sudo. So sudo is basically a command which gives you permission to access administrator files, files that you do not get access to generally, right? So sudo cp and ls is the file I want to copy into my new file, which is 𝐶𝐞𝐤𝐚, and that's it. It's been copied. Now basically, since I copied the contents of ls into this new file which is called 𝐶𝐞𝐤𝐚, let's see what happens when you sudo into 𝐶𝐞𝐤𝐚 instead, right? So as you can see, different files in ls are basically now here copied into the file which is called 𝐶𝐞𝐤𝐚, right? So this is how you copy files. Let's go back. So next up, let's just talk about another command that we have called rm, right? So let's say sudo rm ls, right? Now let's go, let's say ls. So as you can see, we've just removed the file ls, right? First, what we did is we copied the contents of ls into 𝐶𝐞𝐤𝐚, and now you can see we've removed file ls, and this is basically not there in the directory anymore. Now basically, as you can see, there's no ls. So let's check out 𝐶𝐞𝐤𝐚 because that's the file we copied it into. As you can see, 𝐶𝐞𝐤𝐚 has all the files that were present in the ls file, right? So to change that back to ls, all you need to do is sudo cp 𝐶𝐞𝐤𝐚 and ls, right? And clear it out. And let's just check ls now. Now, if you go check ls, now the copy of contents of 𝐶𝐞𝐤𝐚 are now in ls, and that is how you can basically copy paste any of the contents in your folder into any other folder, right? So let's check out something else now. So let's just try something else. So since we know that every single thing in Linux is basically a file, so the command, just like ls, the command cat is also a file. So can you really concatenate a cat folder? You can write cat. Let's see what happens, right? So this is exactly what happens. You go on and on and on, and this is basically your cat folder. And it keeps on going until you do this. So we'll just clear this out. So you can basically concatenate the concatenate file with the same command, right? So this is pretty interesting. So let's not go check out some other directories that are there, right? So cd/dot. You go back, go to ls. Let's check out, let's say, your library, right? Or the sbin that you have. So these are the sbin files that you have. So let's check them out. Let's see if we can really do something. Yeah. Right. So there is this command called add user, which is also a file which is present in the sbin directory, right? So let's see what happens when you have add user. So let's basically say we want to create a new user. That is basically the command for adding a new user. So let's do sudo because you need administrator permissions, sudo and then add user, and let's say new user's name Reka, right? So this is going to be right. So basically what you need is full name. Let's say you can just right. So now you basically have created a new user called Edureka, which has full name of course be, and you can basically skip these. You want to add all of the room number, work phone, and home number. If you want to, you can do that, but the entire point of this is to show you how you create a new user from an existing user, right? So basically, let's go back and check something else out. Right then, let's go back into the directory and do ls. Let's check out some other directories now. Let's cd into, let's say, user directory, right? So as you can see here, there's a separate bin that is there here inside the usr directory as well. So if we cd into the bin directory that it has, see what's there. So as you can see, the bin directory is kind of similar to your root bin directory that is there. Now, if you can check, there are most of the files that you see here are already there in the root bin directory, right? So what is basically different and which directory are you using when you basically store files? Where is the file getting stored, right? So to do that, you will basically have to type in this command. Let's say which ls are you using. So you use the ls command which is stored in the user directory, right? Same, let's go for which cat, right? Which concatenate. Same here in the user directory, which cp. So all of these are there present inside the user directory, right? And not in the root bin directory that you have. Although the files in the root bin directory and your user bin directory are kind of similar, except there are certain more files that are present in the user directory, right? So let's now go check out some of the other directories that are there. So let's just cd back, cd back here. Right. So let's check out some of the other directories that you have. So the boot directory will consist of files that you have to boot, right? That you need to boot. Now the temp directory is the directory which has temporary files that are present there, right? The media directory is basically the directory which lets you connect or mount any external storage device automatically. So if you cd into media and check out what's in there, there is no other external storage device that is in there right now, so there's nothing in the media file also. So let's check out some other directories that are there, right? So let's check out the home directory. So home, as we talked about, is the directory which contains the user's personal directories, right? So if you ls into this, you will see that there is another new user that's been created, which is Edureka, right? Along with the KB user that was there. Now this has only been created because we've used the add user command, right? So this is basically showing you all the users that are present. Now if you want to, let's say, ls into them, cd kb and ls into this, you can see that your personal directory and files are here, right? So next up, let's just check out some other folders. Let's do cd, right? Right. So let's check out dev, which is the devices, right? If you check out the devices, so if you go into devices, what you can see is SDA and SDA1. So these four that you see here are the various virtual drives that you have, virtual disks that you have on Linux, right? So these are the various devices you have. So if you go back, let's say, let's clear it out, right? So, and finally, let's go check out what proc is. Right. So this is basically a file which is not really there, right? Now proc is basically something which is created every time your system starts up. It's not there when your system shut down. Every time it starts up, it has a file called proc. Now this proc file will basically have information related to the ongoing processes that you have. The memory management, hardware configurations. So every Linux system has a proc file, no matter which version it is, right? Whenever you start up a Linux system, you will have a proc file. So let's go back. Let's check out our network directory now. So for network directory, we have to cd into etc, right? If you listen to this, you can see that networks right here. Now you can cd into networks, right? So this is basically what you have. This is your network. Now what you need to find from here is the different files that you have. So these are the different files. Let's say you turn out into this, right? And you listen to this. You can have these files, right? And you can just check the VPN connection using, let's say, cd open, right? So finally, what we'll do is check out where the hidden files are there. So you can just, so as you can see, this is basically the computer where you have all your directories and you have all of these are visible and you have hidden files because Linux allows you to have hidden files. So to check out the hidden files that you have, all you have to do is control H, right? All these are basically, right? So as you can see, these are all authenticated files. And so if you just go into this and do control H, you can see the number of files that are there have increased, right? These are other files that are there, right? So just to see the files which are hidden in Linux, all you need to do is control H. So this is all about the directories that are there in Linux. And with that, I end today's session. Thank you and have a nice day.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!